Next item of business is a debate on motion 20110 in the name of Aileen Campbell on achieving a fairer Scotland. Can I ask those members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now? And I call on Aileen Campbell to open the debate. Minister, please, and move the motion. Cabinet Secretary, please, and move the motion.
Oh, thank you
I'm
very
demoting
much.
you.
Presiding Officer, thank you. Oh, Deputy Presiding Officer, I should say. Thank you.
At least that was going in the right direction.
Oh, sorry. Anyway, it's the season of goodwill, and that'll probably be where we end and depart from any goodwill today, no doubt. However, thank you, Presiding Officer. Today's debate provides an opportunity to focus on our aims to achieve a fairer and more equal Scotland. And in 2016, we published our Fairer Scotland Action Plan, outlining 50 actions for this parliamentary term, built on 5 high-level ambitions to achieve a fairer Scotland by 2030. And I'm proud that our third-year progress report, published this week, shows all 50 actions are in progress, with 19 completed and 11 forming continuous programmes of work. Our report also sets out the progress we have made against each of the recommendations made by the Independent Advisor on Poverty and Inequality, Naomi Eisenstadt, which has been very much embedded in our action to build a fairer Scotland. And while we have delivered progress and continue to work hard within the powers that we have to create that fairer Scotland, we act against a backdrop of over 1 million Scots living in poverty, including almost 1 in 4 children and an increasing reliance on crisis support such as food banks. Scottish Government estimates are that UK Government spending on welfare social security in Scotland will reduce by up to £3.7 billion by 2020-21. At the same time, the Scottish budget has been cut in real terms by around £2 billion. No wonder, then, that the Trade Union Congress recently said that this has been a decade of failed austerity. And we know that poverty levels are set to rise. The Resolution Foundation is the latest organisation to point to the rising tide, saying that if another Conservative government was returned, then child poverty was at risk of reaching a record 60-year high, because they will continue with a decade of welfare cuts that has led to hardship, desperation and the poverty that we've all seen in our constituencies. So what do the Conservatives offer us in their manifesto to help those families? Well, not much, Presiding Officer. Despite the words of the UN rapporteur describing Tory welfare cuts as inflicting great misery, there are only 2 mentions of poverty in their whole manifesto. In one sentence, saying that it will, I quote, continue efforts to reduce poverty, including child poverty. This lack of mention, not surprising, I guess, given that Minister Priti Patel deflected blame for rising poverty despite being in power for a decade by saying it's not the government though, is it? But, Presiding Officer, rises in poverty are down to the UK Government and their actions. The benefit freeze, the local housing allowance freeze, the benefit cap, the shocking 2-child cap and rape clause, and the diabolical universal credit rollout, and other changes are having real and drastic impacts on families across the country. On top of this, we face the uncertainty posed by Brexit. Independent analysis has predicted that leaving the EU will result in the economy shrinking, threatening jobs, incomes and government revenues. And recent Scottish Government analysis has projected that in a no-deal situation, 130,000 Scots could be pushed into poverty. So this government will not sit back and spectate on poverty. Instead, we'll continue to work hard to protect the people of Scotland and to tackle poverty and inequality. And that work was recognised by the UN Special Rapporteur when he said in a recent lecture that Scotland is on a very different trajectory than England when it comes to the social protection of its population. So, Presiding Officer, there is a chasm between the approaches of this Scottish Government and the UK Government over the last decade. Child poverty levels after housing costs are 6 percentage points lower in Scotland than the rest of the UK, and that is down to the unique approach to housing we have in Scotland, our investment in social housing stock and ensuring quality, affordable and sustainability in our social rented housing. And I'm proud of our achievements, delivering more than 87,000 affordable homes since 2007, nearly 60,000 of which were for social rent, including more than 12,000 council homes. And our spend per head on the Affordable Housing Supply Programme is 3 times higher than the UK Government spending on their Affordable Homes Programme. In the 4 years to 2018, we have delivered 50% more affordable housing units per head of population than in England and 75% more per head of population than in Wales. Beyond this, we are taking strong action to end homelessness, and our action to eradicate fuel poverty is underpinned by ambitious statutory targets. And we're also helping families access the advice and support that they need. And we know that many people across the country don't claim the full benefits they are entitled to and pay over the odds for the likes of electricity and gas. Our new Money Talk team service is helping to combat this, and since its launch in November last year, has helped more than 5,000 households to be better off by more than £10 million, an average of just under £2,000 per household. And our benefit uptake strategy for devolved benefits will ensure people receive the devolved benefits to which they are rightly entitled. Our investment in early learning and childcare will reach nearly £1 billion by 2021-22, benefiting around 80,000 households and providing greater support for families. We're almost doubling funded provision for all 3- and 4-year-olds and for eligible 2s to 1,140 hours by August next year. This universal offer and targeted provision has the potential to be truly transformative for children and for their parents. For children, the expansion provides a high-quality learning environment, helping to prepare them for school, supporting their development and helping to narrow the attainment gap. And for parents, it will save families on average £4,500 a year, as well as help families and parents return to work or increase their hours. And we're exercising our full influence to make workplaces fairer too. Scotland already has the highest level of individuals paid the real living wage or above at over 83%, and the lowest rate of 0 hours contracts in the UK. Our ambition, though, doesn't extend to simply exceeding the standards set in the rest of the country, and that is why we have committed to building a living wage nation, lifting an additional 25,000 individuals onto the real living wage of £9.30 an hour through employer accreditation by 2021. And we've set out ambitious action in our Fair Work Action Plan and have revised the Scottish Business Pledge to focus on the key issues that need to be addressed. And we're also going further. Through our Tackling Child Poverty Delivery Plan, we have committed £22 million for new parental employment support. This investment will support parents in work to increase their earnings and progress through a career. It will build strong links with early learning and childcare, both in helping parents to take advantage of the new jobs our expansion is creating, and also, though, to take advantage of the funded hours. Our new employability services are helping more people access employment. Fair Start Scotland, the cornerstone of our new approach, is voluntary, and since launching in April 2018, it's supported over 16,000 people and helped over 4,000 into work. But that is only part of the story. Fair Start Scotland's first annual report showed that of over 1,000 participants surveyed, 92% of people who have used the service felt that they were treated with dignity and with respect. And dignity and respect are the guiding principles for the action that this government takes and are at the very heart of our newest public service, Social Security Scotland. A system that is there to support people at the times they need it, when they need it, providing not a handout but an investment in the most important resource our country has, our people. And during the important early years, our Best Start grant helps families to buy the essentials for their new child when they are born and at key stages in their wee one's life. Our carers allowance supplement, worth an additional £452 to carers this year, goes some way to recognise the invaluable work of the thousands of carers across Scotland. And we've also pledged significant new investment of £180 million a year through our Scottish Child Payment, which will be fully rolled out by 2022, with early payments for under 6s starting to be paid before next Christmas. The pace at which we are delivering this new benefit is unprecedented. The Child Poverty Action Group called the payment game-changing in our fight against child poverty, given that it will shift the curve and lift 30,000 children out of poverty when it is fully rolled out. But really importantly, it will also help to anchor the families of the 410,000 children set to benefit it against being pulled into the trap of poverty. So, Presiding Officer, I've offered a glimpse of the actions that we are taking and the powers that we are using to make our country fairer. But whilst national action is important, our local partners have a strong role to play too. The first local child poverty action reports demonstrate how much good work is happening across the length and breadth of the country, linking together programmes and delivering the frontline services that folk access. The Poverty and Inequality Commission welcomed this activity, and they have recently shared their views on how this can be built on in future years. Together with COSLA, NHS Health Scotland, the Improvement Service and others, we will continue to support local areas to maximise their impact and support our collective action. So, Presiding Officer, at birth, every child in Scotland is eligible to receive the baby box. And that is a symbol, an important symbol, of the equality that we want for every person in Scotland throughout their life. We know that a fairer Scotland, though, won't be achieved without action, and we are absolutely committed to making this happen. Children, after all, only get one shot at childhood, and it's important that we make sure that we get it right. So earlier this year, we estimated that in 2018-19, we invested over £1.4 billion in support directed at low-income households across Scotland. That, though, included over £100 million to mitigate the worst impacts of UK government welfare reforms. And through our spending review, we are focusing on child poverty and wellbeing as the lens that must guide our investment decisions to make Scotland a fairer place. The actions of this government, though, do stand in stark contrast to the Conservative government at Westminster, and it really is a tale of two governments. So while we mop up the mess and mitigate against the callous and punitive acts of the UK government, we are not content. We'll not be content to sit back, accept poverty as inevitable. So with the powers that we have, we are being bold and we are being ambitious to create a fairer Scotland. On housing, on childcare, on employment and on the Scottish Child Payment, we are using our powers to build a better, fairer Scotland, where our future will see food banks relegated to the past and where child poverty has been truly eradicated. So, Presiding Officer, I move the motion in my name and look forward to the debate ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I now call Jeremy Balfour to speak to and move Amendment 20110.1. Mr Balfour, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Deputy Presiding Officer, I have to say, when I saw the title for this debate last week, I was genuinely excited that we could have a constructive debate around where we want to go and where we are. Because all of us across this chamber want to live in a fairer Scotland. But what we've seen in regard to the motion and the amendments by the other political parties is a papering over of where we are in Scotland and the failings of this government that has been in power for over a decade. Now, we all acknowledge that some progress in some areas has been made, but it is slow and patchy, and actually when you look at reality on the ground, many people are still missing out because of this lack of action in the Scottish Government. Let me just give a few examples of it, if I could just develop this point for a moment. Let me start with education. Education, we all agree, is the key for young people, particularly those perhaps in poverty, to be able to move out and have fresh opportunities. But just yesterday, we hear again that the Scottish Government education policy is failing all our children here in Scotland. In maths, behind England and Northern Ireland. In science, we're behind England and Northern Ireland. In fact, we're notably behind those two countries. And in reading, we are behind England as well. In the papers today, Lindsay Patterson gives a damning reflection on where we are in regard to our education policy and why so many people in Scotland are failing. And yet this government simply will not listen to the experts, will not listen to the parents, will not listen to the teachers in regard to what they should be doing. I'll give way to Ms Ewan.
I was just going to say, Mr Balfour, I'll let you talk about education to a degree in this debate, but the debate really isn't, you don't even mention it in your amendment. So keep to your amendment and keep to attacking what's on the business bulletin. Ms Ewing.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm grateful to the member for giving way. I mean, on the PISA statistics, maybe the member might want to have another read at it because it wasn't an accurate reflection. But on the key central issue that he started off with, which I believe forms part of the subject of this debate, on the key central issue of poverty that we see in our country in 21st century Scotland, given that social security spend by value of around 85% is still controlled from Westminster, surely rather the situation is an indictment on successive Westminster governments and not the Scottish Government, which, as he has said, the SNP government's been in power since 2007. Let's look at the decade upon decade upon decade of systematic neglect by Westminster of Scotland.
There's plenty of time in hand to make your time back, Mr Balfour.
I mean, I think that Deputy Presiding Officer is a classic example of this government and their backbenchers. They look at the statistics of education and simply ignore them and say the experts are wrong, parents are wrong, teachers are wrong, we know best. And the reason I developed this theme, Deputy Presiding Officer, is because if we want to move people out of poverty, then education is a key around that. And what we have seen is Mr Swinney dropping the bill. The First Minister said, judge us on our education, and the answer is they have failed dismally in the last 10 years of this. And until we get movement in regard to this, and my colleague Alison Harris will come back to what was happening at a younger age of this, then we are simply going to fail. But if education is a failure, then let's look at employability and disability and how that is working as well. Because what have we seen around this? Well, in fact, we've seen the government failing on this as well. We had a members' debate here yesterday evening where we had lots of warm words from the ministers. But again, let's look at what the statistics say. People who are disabled in Scotland, disabled people are 45.4% in employment. The figure in England is 51%. That is a substantial gap in regard to if you're disabled and looking for employment in Scotland. And again, we are seeing lack of vision and policies coming forward from this government, taking those with disabilities out of poverty, giving them fresh opportunities and allowing them to develop. And we are again letting down individuals in our society who want to work but are simply not getting those opportunities. I was interested that the Cabinet Secretary went and talked about benefits. I thought she was very brave to do that, I have to say, because this Scottish Government's record is give us the power and then we'll hand them back to the DWP quicker than you can say any word in the English language. They simply do not want the powers that they have been given. They are handing them back. We had a commitment from the previous Cabinet Secretary, Jean Freeman, when she said in this chamber and said on numerous occasions at the Social Security Committee that all the powers will be up and running fully before the 2021 election. And now we hear from the Cabinet Secretary that will not be the case. And so, again, another broken promise by the government. Absolutely.
Cabinet Secretary.
Grateful to Jeremy Balfour for allowing me the intervention. We will have accountability and the powers for social security coming to this Parliament next year. The timetable has been laid out for a safe and secure transition. That is understood by stakeholders. Can I ask him what he would change? Because the changes we have made is to allow us to deliver the Scottish Child Payment. Is he saying we shouldn't deliver that? What would he move? What would he speed up, despite the fact that we are absolutely determined to have a safe and secure transition to this? What would he change?
Well, first I would change. I wouldn't make promises I cannot keep as a government. That's the first thing I would change. And secondly, I have to say, with due respect to the Cabinet Secretary, what I am hearing from stakeholders is a very different message. They're hearing concern, they're hearing uncertainty, because they simply do not know what is going to come down the road from this government. They do not know exactly what they're getting because you will not tell us what the regulations are. And if this government generally wanted... Do you want to intervene?
Cabinet Secretary, yes, please don't just have your little sort of dialogue across the chamber. Through the chair, ask for an intervention. That's the way to do it. And the member shouldn't have to ask you to intervene. You should be standing on your feet asking for it.
The point being...
I'm sorry, are you asking for an intervention and are you taking it? Let's move on. There we go.
I'm very grateful to Jeremy Ball for the second intervention. The stakeholders are working with us to develop the regulations that will go to the Commission, that will have further development through the Commission. There's a process for this. It will come to the committee. The timetable is laid out. And my fair scaremongering around what's happening in social security doesn't do the Conservatives any good because it absolutely lacks in credibility. The stakeholders know that, and I'm afraid you're digging more of a hole for yourself today than actually helping to work with us to get what everybody wants, which is a successful benefit system. So I say again, what would you change? And I'm hearing absolutely nothing in the timetable that you would actually change.
Jeremy Balfour.
Well, what I would have done, or what we would have done as a party, that we would have delivered all the benefits by 2021, as you promised. Because, in fact, you promised you could do it all in 18 months, and you've simply failed to do that. I'm afraid I do probably have to make some progress, if that's okay. So what we have here is that we have people who are looking to know what are the benefits going to be with a lack of certainty in regard to that. Finally, Deputy Presiding Officer, we also see that this government simply wants to tax people more as well. We've seen taxes going up. We've seen the UK government move personal allowances up to 12,500. We're lifting thousands of Scots out of poverty in regard to that way. We've seen a government that doesn't just talk it, but actually does things that makes radical changes in people's lives. And so that's the difference, I would argue, Deputy Presiding Officer, between this government's motion and the amendment in my name today. And let's be absolutely clear that we will not make changes by simply talking and talking and talking. What we need to see is actually action from this government to help the most vulnerable in our society. And that is why I move the amendment in my name. Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, Mr Balfour. I now call on Pauline McNeill to speak to move amendment 20110.3, please.
Presiding Officer, anyone who's out knocking doors in this general election, and that's probably all of us, but not today, can't fail to notice the striking gap between those who have and those who have not. It certainly struck me. It can vary from community to community, it can vary from street to street, but it's clear to me that we have a very long way to go in creating a fairer Scotland. And until we can say that we have significantly closed the gap. Because according to Shelter, one child in Scotland has been made homeless every 37 minutes over the past year. And that's 14,000 children in total. And statistics like this indicate how far we have to go in achieving the goal of a fairer Scotland. I believe the Scottish Government must lead ambitiously, and our amendment calls on them to be more ambitious in their aims. The report shows that there are too many areas where they have not gone far enough. I do believe that it cannot be done without the involvement of partners, people in the third sector, and even opposition parties themselves, playing a constructive role where we can. But like the Cabinet Secretary, I have to acknowledge, and it's been used many times, that the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights for 2019 report clearly stated that the UK Government's austerity cuts, its welfare reforms, are a key driver of serious hardship, increased food banks, use and homelessness. And I would say to the Tories, I don't think we can have an all-round constructive approach, at least until the party acknowledge the role that universal credit and welfare reforms has made in creating hardship in Scotland. Creating a more fair Scotland is, of course, more than just tackling poverty and improving incomes. And I think it's a very important thing to understand that it is about the lack of opportunity, not getting the same chances as others, maybe not getting the right help when you need it. And poorer people tend to not move in the same networks as wealthier people. Creating fairness is, of course, wide-ranging and includes climate change and the fairness for future generations and the urgent need to be inclusive as we go forward to ensure that people on low incomes are not left behind as we make changes towards a low-carbon future, a discussion I think we need to have in depth at another time. I'm also struck these days by the number of young people with disadvantage in their lives. Other MSPs can't fail to notice this. Young carers, we've discussed. Many young people who suffer ill health. I chair the cross-party group on Crohn's and colitis, and I'm staggered that Scotland's presiding over a rising number of young people who are ill. And that, of course, includes those young people who suffer ill mental health. So we must equip our schools and our colleges with the resources to help these young people who may falter to get back on course with their lives when they may have lost out in school. Naomi Eisenstadt, who I think is the best appointment that the Scottish Government has made to date, is eloquent on this subject. I mean, she points out that we need to value non-academic routes more, and we've all said this, all of us. She says, in most areas, a significant proportion of young people will not be aiming at a degree and leaving school. These young people should get comparable care and attention to their futures, and that is regularly devoted to more academic young people. Now, we've all said it, but I do think there's going to have to be more focus on what she said there. A Fairer Scotland is one which welcomes refugees. A Fairer Scotland is one which sets the bar for a real living wage amongst government and government contractors. There must be fair pay and fair employment rights too, because precarious employment amongst young people, and again, we know the stories of young people who don't get any rights in their employment. And that's why that we will support the devolvement of employment rights, because we believe that there will be a better chance of protecting those young people on zero-hour contracts, precarious employment, protection at work if we have these powers closer to home. And I recognise that we must work with trade unions too in a Fairer Scotland. The Poverty and Inequality Commission reported in January that one of the most worrying trends, and Jeremy Balfour is quite right about this, is the increase in households with a disabled person who are living in poverty. So while it's only a 1% increase, it does represent 40,000 people. So it's a very, very important figure, I think, to bear in mind. It is a huge topic to address in a short speech. There's a few other things I'd like to focus on. Last year, KPMG reported that the proportion of jobs paying less than the living wage was 19%. And I acknowledge what the Cabinet Secretary said about Scotland's figures in this regard. But that figure again represents 435,000 people. And the Poverty and Equality Commission say that the government's target is not ambitious enough, perhaps looking for a push on the hospitality sector, which is the highest proportion of people earning under the living wage. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation reported in October that poverty in Scotland is rising from an already unacceptably high level. Almost 1 in 5 people in Scotland live in poverty. And for children, the situation is worse, with 1 in 4 living in poverty. This looks to be set to get even worse as we face the prospect of Brexit, and a lot depends on the outcome of this general election. I'll say no more. But one of the issues which I do think compromises the Scottish Government to some degree in their attempts to tackle poverty is that the new top-up benefits such as the Scottish Child Payment, which we welcome, the rollout doesn't come till 2022, and I fully acknowledge that you will bring, by 2020, you'll bring that forward. And I do also acknowledge the Best Start grant and the Carer Supplement, which has an extremely positive effect. And actually, the way that it's rolled out by the new Social Security Agency, I think the government have got to be commended for that. But for me, the question is how we can ensure the uptake is as high as possible. I know an issue which Shirley-Anne Turnbull has addressed on many occasions. But we do need to examine, I think, in some serious depth, how benefits could be automated to relieve the problem of uptake. And difficult, I know that is. Perhaps the conversion of the Scottish Child Payment from a top-up to a standalone benefit might allow more scope to automate it. I just put that for consideration. The Poverty and Inequality Commission, in fact, says that the government should make more use of new powers, creating new benefits rather than supplementing current ones. So that seems to be their view too. Presiding Officer, housing costs continue to push people in poverty in Scotland. The number of working-age adults in the poorest fifth of the population who spend more than 1/3 of their income on housing has risen over the past 20 years. The number of families living in the private rented sector has risen, and that's not a choice for many people. It's the only choice. And recent statistics indicate that the average cost of renting in the private rented sector has risen in 15 out of the 18 Scottish local authorities, and this is addressed by the Living Rent Union, who warn that it's only going to get worse. So we do need action to curb high rents. I'll talk hopefully another day about my bill to curb high rents. But it has to be recognised that there has to be some serious reform in the private rented sector to get rents down. Otherwise, we're not actually going to tackle child poverty. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, if I had more time, I would address many other issues that my colleagues Sarah Boyer and Claudia Beamish will address about the gender pay gap, and as well as helping vulnerable customers in the energy market who are really not getting a great deal of rights I think they deserve. It is important that we do not underestimate the scale of the task in creating a fairer Scotland. We believe the government needs to be more ambitious. We will support the Green Amendment. We won't be supporting the government amendment. I hope the government would support ours, but in the event that it does not, we will support the government amendment in good faith.
Would you like to move your amendment, Ms McNeill? Move your own amendment?
I move my own amendment, I should have said.
I take it you're supporting that, yeah?
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. I now call Alison Johnson to speak to and move amendment 20110.2 for around 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm going to begin by moving the amendment in my name. The motion rightly notes that by 2020, around £3.7 billion of social security spending will be cut from Scotland as a result of UK welfare reforms. And with the International Day of Disabled Persons taking place just yesterday, I think it's important and timely to highlight just how hard those cuts have hit disabled people. Colleagues have already raised this important issue. A report by the Disability Benefits Consortium released this year shows that disabled people have lost benefit payments of around £1,200 on average each year. For a household with one disabled adult and one disabled child, the average loss is over £4,300. No wonder then that both the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights and the UN Convention on the Rights of Disabled People have raised concerns about the impact of welfare reforms on the fundamental rights of disabled people. Disabled people being forced to travel huge distances to undertake unnecessary, wholly unnecessary benefits assessments that aren't needed and were overturned on appeal more than 2/3 of the time. Disabled people in some cases not being able to work or no longer being able to work because they had mobility vehicles taken off them. So that's the legacy the Scottish Government inherits as it takes on responsibility for some disability benefits. So to build a fairer Scotland, we've got a lot to combat and we need to really radically use the powers that we do now have, as small as they are and as frustrated as some of us might be about that. The significant change of direction on the use of assessments in line with the legal requirements instituted by Greens is potentially a sea change. It should mean that we get more accurate decisions on benefit assessment that avoid putting people through assessments which often simply recreate evidence that was already there in the first place. And we also need to look at the levels of support that we're offering and how broad the eligibility criteria are. The current disability benefit for older people, attendance allowance, doesn't offer support for mobility, despite this being available for young people, and I am concerned that the Scottish Government plans to replicate this unfairness. Now, the 20-metre rule was a cynical attempt to reduce spending at the expense of people's needs, and it must end. So I welcome the Scottish Government's openness to ending the 20-metre rule, and I hope that this will result in more disabled people getting the support they need. As well as many others, those changes will require a significant reinvestment in social security, and clearly that investment will need to be funded to a significant extent by higher taxes. And that's why it's so important that we continue to make our tax system more progressive, raising funds from those who can afford to pay a bit more. Income tax is fairer in Scotland as a result of budget changes won by Greens, and now we need to rise to the challenge on local taxation laid down by Naomi Eisenstadt in the Shifting the Curve report. In that report, written almost 4 years ago, Professor Eisenstadt said that we'd reached a central moment of political decision, an opportunity to introduce a much more progressive system, one that will have important implications, particularly for working households at or just above the poverty line. Yet the council tax is still with us. It is still outdated. Most households are still paying the wrong amount, and it is still restricting local authorities' ability to better fund public services, to reduce poverty and to build fairer communities. So that's why I'm bringing an amendment today that underlines the importance of the cross-party talks on council tax reform, hopefully resulting in the replacement of council tax with a progressive alternative. It is urgently needed. Like rebuilding our social security system, introducing a fairer system of local taxation, it's a huge challenge. It's one that I don't underestimate, but it's one to which this Parliament must rise if we're to build a fairer Scotland. The motion also mentions the need to, my amendment also mentions the need to review the Scottish Welfare Fund to ensure that it's able to support those who've been impacted by welfare reforms and other people needing urgent help with their incomes or to live independent lives. The Welfare Fund offers vital support to people suffering income crisis, often brought on by those welfare reforms, and I'd like to pay tribute to the local government officials across the country who help people in really difficult circumstances. 95% of crisis grants are processed within the target time of 2 working days, and that's a figure that's improved within the lifetime of the fund, and that reflects the dedication and the hard work of those who process the Welfare Fund applications. But now that the fund's been operating for a good few years and a time of seemingly never-ending welfare reform, it's an appropriate moment to review the fund to ensure that it is able to help everyone who needs it. So the underspends that marked the early years of the programme, they're now largely a thing of the past in most areas, and the majority of local authorities spend around their full Scottish Government allocation or indeed overspend and provide additional funding themselves. This year, a report from Menu for Change showed that some local authorities don't always advertise the Welfare Fund or its availability because they're concerned that they'll have more applications than they're able to handle. Now, if that is the case, then we clearly need to urgently review the level of support that the government is providing at the moment. And for those reasons, I'd appreciate the support of members from across the chamber for my amendment. Before I close, I would like to address the motion's focus on rising food bank use. We should be deeply concerned that the Trussell Trust warn that use of food banks in Scotland is at an all-time high. At 210,605 food parcels issued in the last year, a third of those to children. And it's important to remember that food bank statistics don't reveal the true depth of the problem. About a third of food banks aren't included in the most commonly used Trussell Trust statistics, and many people who are struggling to pay for food don't always use food banks. Presiding Officer, I am aware that I'm over time. I will close for now and address more of these issues in my summing up later. Thank you.
Thank you. Alex Cole-Hamilton for around 6 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm grateful to the Government for bringing forward this motion today, and as always, there is much common ground between our parties on this issue. Liberal Democrats, like other parties in this chamber, have a vision for building a brighter future, one that is free from discrimination and intolerance, to build a United Kingdom that is more equal and fair, and a United Kingdom where we all have the same opportunities, regardless of where we come from or the circumstances of our birth. I would like to start by giving the Scottish Government some credit. Flicking through the latest progress report, there is a fair amount of purple in its pages. I count 19 of the 50 actions have been marked as completed, and I congratulate them for that. Among them, I am very glad to see positive changes, like the domestic abuse bill, and refugee families settling here getting quick access to assistance. But much of what has been completed represents very much the low-hanging fruit, and we now need to reach much higher to increase the scope of our ambition in this regard. I'd like to take a few minutes, Presiding Officer, to cover those items that are currently in progress for delivery by this administration. Currently marked as in progress, we have the R100 programme. That's due to be completed by 2021, but I am slightly concerned that we're starting to see noises from the government that we may be moving that date, and I would like some reassurance in the summation around this debate about that and about the date by which that should be completed. A reform of the Gender Recognition Act is also in progress too. My party has called for this for years, but again, I'm concerned that reform may have been kicked into the long grass, and the timetable is very challenging now for it to be delivered within this Parliament. There is no guarantee it will happen in this Parliament, and that's despite all MSPs in this chamber standing for election on a manifesto in support of it. I'm concerned that for every day that we do not debate that in this chamber, it is debated in wider society and subjected to hyperbole and to misinformation. And also marked as in progress is the commitment to put an additional graduate in every nursery in more deprived areas, and I quote, by 2018. But this target was missed by a huge margin in August last year when it was due. Only half, 234 of the 435 extra staff were in place in time, and they still aren't in post even today. So I can't understand why it isn't marked red within that progress report. Perhaps the Minister might illuminate the chamber as to that. That brings me neatly on to the issue of funded childcare. Liberal Democrats succeeded in persuading the Scottish Government to expand free childcare, and we're grateful to them for the steps that they have taken in that regard. And we made the case again and again that it was one of the most effective ways to close the attainment gap between rich and poor children. Our parties are in agreement on that point. That social leveller that nurseries represent. But as we've heard, the rollout has encountered problems. For example, the uptake for 2-year-olds isn't anywhere close to where we want it to be. Some providers are struggling to get by at a time when business should be good. And Liberal Democrats want to take that expansion much, much further. We want free, high-quality childcare for every child aged 2 to 4 for 35 hours a week, 48 weeks a year. Working parents will get free childcare from when their child is 9 months old. This will close the gap between the end of paid parental leave and the start of free childcare provision. And it will also begin to help to close the gender pay gap. We all know people, the vast majority of them women, who in the face of astronomical childcare fees have opted to stay at home rather than return to work or go back to work on a far more diminished timescale, often missing out on further opportunities for career progression. A Liberal Democrat government would give the Scottish Government the funding to match this commitment, the most ambitious in the UK, making this a UK-wide shared endeavour and will help promote take-up and train enough staff. Presiding Officer, there's no avoiding the fact that the current constitutional chaos that hangs over everything good that we want to do in Scotland. Independence and Brexit would both mean less money to invest in children's education and transforming mental health services. And we are fighting to stop Brexit to get a £50 billion Remain bonus to tackle inequality and invest in public services. And we want to stop independence and avoid a decade of SNP-inflicted austerity, because that's what their own Growth Commission has forecast. And overnight, the Institute for Fiscal Studies has confirmed that. Implementing the SNP's General Election Manifesto in an independent Scotland would lead to more cuts than even the Conservative plans for UK spending. Meanwhile, the head of the Scottish Civil Service has warned the First Minister that her referendum planning means a deprioritisation of domestic policy. Our education and our mental health services simply cannot afford a further distraction of government time. Just yesterday, we saw Scotland slip further down the international rankings in science and in maths, recording their worst ever results. And we saw the worst child mental health rates ever recorded last week. The government denied there was even a crisis. I want this to be the government's #1 priority. These are the cornerstones of our vision for a brighter future. I got into politics to make our country fairer, and it is so much easier to do without the constitutional stranglehold that is applied to this country by both constitutional issues. If I turn briefly to the amendments, for the Conservatives, I cannot support Jeremy Balfour's amendment because of what it removes. Since 2015, the UK government has made unnecessary, ideological-driven, brutal cuts to welfare. The Tories single-handedly undermined universal credit by removing billions of pounds from the system. On Labour, we absolutely agree that universal credit is not working. It's driven by driving people to food bans, plunged them into a cycle of arrears and left people destitute. Labour supported the introduction of universal credit alongside many poverty campaigners at the time, and it desperately needs reform. But scrapping it altogether and starting again is impractical, especially given Labour can't tell us what they would replace it with, and it would amount to huge amounts of money being spent on yet more administration. I want that money spent on supporting people instead, and I want it used to reform universal credit, injecting dignity and respect into the system. Finally, on the Greens, I actually am persuaded by Alison Johnston's argument in terms of the review of the Social Welfare Fund, so we will be supporting that tonight, and I will close because I have run out of time. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
We'll move now to the open debate, and the speeches are 6 minutes. I do have some time in hand, so I can allow extra time for any interventions, etc. And first of all, call Annabel Ewing to be followed by Alison Harris.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm pleased to have been called to speak in this important Scottish Government debate this afternoon on achieving a fairer Scotland. And at the outset, can I say, as the MSP for Cowdenbeath constituency, that it is absolutely unacceptable that children in my constituency are growing up in poverty, that they are losing out on opportunities, and that they don't have the same life chances as other children can take for granted. That shames me, Presiding Officer, and that should shame every single member of this Parliament. But, Presiding Officer, shame is not enough. For we must identify the structural issues at play and we must sort them out. And it could not be clearer that the key structural issue facing people in my constituency and right across Scotland is the lack of power, the power to make a generational difference to poverty in our country. For without power, we cannot deliver the changes we need to see. And without power, we lack the tools to fix the scandal of poverty in energy-rich Scotland. And of course, the power that I am talking about, Presiding Officer, is the power of a normal, independent country where we would have the power to control all of our resources, the power to decide how our resources are spent, the power to determine our own priorities based on the needs of our people, and the power to have the government that we actually vote for. For far too long, Scotland has been in this invidious condition, and aside from any other considerations, that in and of itself evidences the stark fact that the Union is simply not working for Scotland. For these appalling statistics are sadly an indictment of life under the Union, with successive Tory and Labour governments failing the people of Scotland and failing generations of children in Scotland. And this has been exacerbated, of course, in recent years with Tory austerity and welfare cuts, leaving families right across Scotland struggling to pay their bills and to feed their children. We know from analysis published last year that UK government cuts will see, as has been said, some £3.7 billion from the social security spent in Scotland by 2021. We know too that the benefit cap is affecting more than 3,000 households, which are losing an average of more than £3,000 per annum. We know that 8,500 Scottish families have already seen their income cut by the Universal Credit two-child limit. And we know too that around 5,600 couples in Scotland could lose up to £7,000 per annum by 23-24, resulting from the Tories' changes to personal credit slipped out by way of a written ministerial statement. What cowardice. And of course, we have seen the hardship caused by the flawed rollout of universal credit, including resulting, therefore, in significant increases in recourse to food banks. This is the Britain of the poor house, Presiding Officer. It is so bad that the UN Special Rapporteur reported that UK government welfare cuts are, and I quote, punitive, mean-spirited and often callous. And as the Cabinet Secretary herself referred to in her opening remarks, the Rapporteur went on to say that these cuts were, and I quote, unnecessarily inflicting great misery. But in, indeed, a tale of two governments, Presiding Officer, we here in Scotland, meanwhile, have seen our SNP Scottish Government take strong and decisive action in the face of such cuts, and that within the powers we actually have to help to tackle poverty and tackle income inequality and to build a fairer and more prosperous Scotland. Witness, for example, as we've heard, the Scottish Child Payment worth £10 per week per child, with the first payments to be paid out for the under 6 on an accelerated timescale by Christmas 2020, and very well done to the Cabinet Secretary for Social Security for ensuring that that will happen. This payment is intended at its heart to fundamentally shift the curve of poverty and has been described by the Child Poverty Action Group as a game changer for child poverty in Scotland. I entirely agree with that description. And just imagine if, therefore, we had 100% social security powers over the spend available. And just imagine if that was available to the Scottish Government, as opposed to just 15%, which is the case, regrettably, at this time, a situation that both Labour and the Tories supported in the Smith Commission. We can also point, Presiding Officer, to the difference that the Best Start grant is making to families in Scotland, another example of decisive action from the Scottish Government. And we can also point to, for example, free school meals for Primary 1 to Primary 3, which Labour voted against, help with school uniforms, the carer supplement, which Polly McNeill referred to, free prescriptions, all examples of the Scottish Government doing what it can within the powers that it has. But here's the rub, Presiding Officer. While we see this much-needed investment on the part of the Scottish Government to support low-income households, at the same time, we see year on year some £100 million having to be spent on mitigating the worst impacts of UK government welfare policy. That is money that therefore cannot be spent elsewhere. Indeed, as the UN Special Rapporteur concluded, and I quote, mitigation comes at a price and it is not sustainable. Presiding Officer, Westminster rules come at a very high price for Scotland, and they are not sustainable. Indeed, what kind of country is it that wants to spend £200 billion on nuclear submarine replacement when we see so many people struggling to get by? And what kind of country is it that under successive Labour and Tory Westminster governments we have seen disabled people treated so shabbily, with individuals having consistently to go through a long and arduous appeal process to get the benefit to which they were entitled in the first place? And what kind of country is it that is content to preside over generations of children losing out on an equitable chance at life? In conclusion, Presiding Officer, Scotland has been too long in this condition. The Westminster system is failing Scotland, and the only way to secure real social justice in our country and to unlock the potential of current and future generations is to be a normal, independent country. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Call Alison Harris to be followed by Stuart McMillan.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I welcome the progress report on the Fairer Scotland Action Plan, and I'm happy to be speaking today, having spoken in the plan's introductory debate back in October 2016. In that debate, I said that there is no magic bullet to achieving an instant reduction in poverty, and this remains true. It is important that we look at the overall picture and that all the portfolios within government work together as a whole. The Fairer Scotland Action Plan was built on this approach, with its 5 key aims covering a variety of policy areas. Number 3 of these 5 aims was early years education and health, and I'm going to focus my contribution today on the pledges the Action Plan made around early years. All of us in the Chamber agree on the impact that an education can have on a child's life. It provides a clearer route for each child to reach their full potential. Many view education as the most important factor in tackling poverty, and I can see why. Pledge number 29 of the Fairer Scotland Action Plan was to increase the number of hours of funded childcare entitlement from 600 to 1140 hours by 2020. This pledge covered all 3- and 4-year-olds as well as the 2-year-olds who are in the greatest need. I know that all parties here fully support this commitment, and we all hope it succeeds. However, I feel it's worth discussing some of the more concerning developments around this pledge, and particularly how they affect children who need the most help in achieving the best start to their lives. A problem that has suffered across the whole country is the number of those eligible 2-year-olds that actually take up the provision. The Scottish Government set a target to double the uptake of 2-year-olds, and whilst I acknowledge that progress has certainly been made on this front, it is still estimated that 40% of eligible 2-year-olds will not be using their entitlement by April 2021. As studies have shown, the option of childcare at this early stage has a greater effect on children from the most deprived backgrounds, and so we should strive to increase this uptake further. Getting the right start in life is invaluable. It helps you throughout your life, it forms the basis for success, and we want to give every child the chance to succeed. I acknowledge the potential of the Scottish Child Payment to help in achieving this, but as I outlined earlier, this must be combined with consistency across government portfolios. It's important to highlight another issue with the childcare pledge. In 2016, the Fairer Scotland Action Plan made reference to the creation of new jobs due to this pledge. Over the years, we have heard several estimates of the extra staff required to fulfil this pledge, but the most recent revision has reduced to around 8,500 new staff. One reason why this figure has been revised down is that local authorities are recruiting staff who are already in the industry, currently working for private, voluntary and independent or PVI sector nurseries. These same staff are nearly all transferring to work in public sector nurseries. A recent survey by the National Day Nurseries Association confirmed this, stating that 9 in 10 PVI sector providers have lost staff in the last year. Council nurseries are able to offer higher salary packages for the same roles due to the difference in the funding rate allocated to the PVI and public sectors. I have spoken before about this inequality in treatment, but today's debate is not about that. Today's debate is about achieving a fairer Scotland. And this staff drain is already affecting the sector. I believe that this will have an impact on the pursuit of the goal of achieving a fairer Scotland going forward. It's always worth remembering that the need for childcare doesn't just start when a child turns 2 or 3. Nurseries in the PVI sector offer an unparalleled, flexible service for parents wishing to use childcare outside of typical work or school hours, or for their young ones who are actually under the age of 2. As I noted in the Action Plan's introductory debate, paid work is a crucial step in the road to leaving poverty behind, a defining goal of the Action Plan. Young parents in particular face increased financial pressures which can create barriers to moving out of poverty. Many mothers of young children therefore want to continue their studies or enter work, and many of these jobs operate outside the usual 9 to 5 day. Therefore, the flexibility offered by the PVI sector enables these parents to enter employment sooner and more confidently than if they'd used some council settings. But here's the problem. The rollout of the 1140 hours has focused so heavily on building and expanding council nurseries that it has led to this drain in staff away from the PVI sector. With the loss of trained and experienced staff, service quality at PVI sector nurseries is at risk, and many will struggle to keep their services open. This has been witnessed in the nurseries that have either closed or sold their businesses in the last year. In trying to make a fairer Scotland, an unintended consequence of the early years pledge has been the loss of vital services which are so necessary to those most in need. The Action Plan's definition of fairer Scotland mentions, and I quote, genuine equality of opportunity, stronger life chances and support for all those who need it. I'm just actually about to finish. As we look ahead to the remaining years of this action plan and the future beyond that, I hope that we can all acknowledge the barriers to delivering these outcomes so that we can tackle them before it's too late. Thank you.
I call Stuart McMillan to be followed by Gil Patterson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, the words punitive, mean-spirited and often callous are damning to say the least, as are unnecessarily inflicting great misery. Now, these are not my words, but those are the words of the UN Special Rapporteur in the report about the UK Government's welfare cuts. The Tories come to this chamber day in, day out, week in, week out, month in, month out, calling for more money to be invested in a range of policy areas, despite their budget proposals from last year, actually cutting £500 million from expenditure. It follows that the tax cuts for the richest would only have made the less well-off even worse off. It's an example of how the Tories don't want a fairer Scotland for everyone. Yet another example were the comments of Michelle Ballantyne, the Tories' welfare spokesperson, who said there is no such thing as the bedroom tax, and the rape clause is fair because people on benefits cannot have as many children as they like. Now, I don't understand how the Tories think that this delivers a fairer Scotland. It could be argued that the Tories are actually, the Tories are writing on benefits, writing off many children and people who are actually on benefits at such an early stage. Now, I don't know if any of the Tories in the chamber actually support Michelle Ballantyne's comments, and if anyone actually want to stand up, then I'm happy to give way. There's only two. Well, there's only two. Okay, they don't. The two of them don't. Presiding Officer, I became involved in politics as I actually want my community and my country to be better and fairer. I grew up in Port Glasgow, and I saw the effects of the devastating policies of the Tory government in my community. Thousands left, and they had to get on their bike, as Tebbit actually declared at the time. There was an increase in alcohol and drugs misuse. It's still afflicting my community today. Now, the root cause, Annabel Ewing spoke about the root cause earlier. The root cause of many of the challenges my constituency faces today actually started off from previous Tory governments. Those challenges didn't get overturned in a few years with the limited powers of this Parliament. And there are actions underway that this SNP government have delivered, which the Cabinet Secretary spoke of in her opening remarks. However, whilst the majority of the tax and spend policies and also the welfare powers still remain at Westminster, then Scotland will always be at the mercy of those in charge in Westminster. Now, I was the first MSP who raised the issue of food banks in this chamber, and I will always support food banks. However, when the evidence presents itself about universal credit is affecting people, then it ill behoves any Tory politician to defend a policy that is pushing more and more people into poverty and desperation. Then there will be the other effects on people's physical and mental health. Now, the Trussell Trust highlight that there's an average of 52% increase in food bank referrals when universal credit goes live. 52% increase. In the last year alone, there has been a 23% increase in emergency food parcel handouts. However, how is this making Scotland fairer? It's not. When constituents come to my office looking for assistance to get food to survive, not thrive, to survive, then it clearly highlights a failure in the UK government's social policy. From the 3rd of September 2012 to the 30th of September 2019, the Inverclyde Food Bank had the following stats. They had 19,220 referrals. Of that, there were 24,996 adults and 8,630 children. That's 33,626 people. If the Tories think this is fair, then the world in which they live, it certainly says a lot about how out of touch the Scottish and the UK Tories are. And with the likes of Johnson, Jacob Rees-Mogg, who's disappeared from the election campaign, and Priti Patel wanting to continue to form our government post next week, then this dystopian nightmare that thousands in my constituency face will only increase in Inverclyde, in Scotland and elsewhere across the UK. It will only get worse if they are successful. The annual report on welfare reforms estimate that the UK government's social security spending will be slashed by up to £3.7 billion in Scotland by 2020-2021. And this indicates that more of the same poverty and desperation will happen. How is that going to make Scotland fairer? Now, Presiding Officer, one final point I want to raise is this. Without the actions of this Scottish Government, this year alone, the situation in my constituency would have been so much worse. If Ferguson Marine had not been taken over, then that would have been a further 300 plus jobs put onto the dole, and 300 more families that would have been adversely affected. And also, if the solution to the closure of Texas Instruments earlier on this year wasn't found, and thankfully Diodes came in and took over the plant. If that didn't happen between the actions of the Scottish Government and the task force that was set up, then that would have been, once again, over 300 jobs being lost to my community and my constituency. Highly paid, highly skilled would have been lost. That would have meant more people getting on their bike to go somewhere else, and also potentially more people signing on, as well as the other aspect of the implications on other public policy areas such as health. This Scottish Government are delivering to actually make Scotland fairer. There is still more to do, and there will always be more to do. However, the draconian policies from a Westminster elite, with absolutely no consideration for the working class, will only exacerbate the lack of fairness in my constituency and also in Scotland. Thank you very much.
Gil Patterson, followed by Claudia James.
Many thanks, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, for so many years under the impact of the UK Government's actions and policy directions, poverty and inequalities in Scotland have increased dramatically. So the publication of the Fairer Scotland Action Plan is a welcome and comprehensive addition to the debate on how we collectively can improve our situation, and details the actions necessary to do so. I think the foreword to the report by Marie-Therese Martin and Susan McMahon, who are Poverty Truth Commissioners, encapsulates the malaise and hopelessness that existed prior to the 2014 Scottish referendum, and the wide-ranging conversations that were engendered throughout Scottish society as part of the referendum campaign itself. In particular, the words previously, we were never thought to question our poverty situation, to look at it, talk about it, and ask what could make it better. It was like we were always waiting for the government or someone else to make a change. Perfectly illustrates the feelings at the time. Work undertaken by the Scottish Government and their partners from all sections of Scottish society since then have changed attitudes dramatically. And despite limited powers to the Scottish Parliament, has made striking improvements to UK welfare arrangements by funding mitigation measures such as the bedroom tax and more. The Scottish Government in financial year 2018-19 invested £1.4 billion supporting low-income households, of which over £2 million was allocated from the Pupil Equity Fund to every school in my constituency as part of the drive to eliminate the educational attainment gap, and that it currently exists, something I very much welcome and appreciate. The eradication of poverty has to be the highest priority for the Scottish Parliament because of all other aspects of inequality in our communities flows from that one source. My quote on that is that poverty and all the other inequalities sleep in the same bed. It is of particular concern that as a result of the UK government's austerity agenda and the draconian welfare policies have pushed thousands of additional families into poverty in Scotland, with many more families' futures put at risk. It is well known that children growing up in poverty will face reduced educational attainment, a poorer health and a shorter life expectancy. The Fairer Scotland Action Plan, first published in 2016, which contains 50 actions designed to tackle poverty, reduce inequalities and build a fairer and more inclusive Scotland, has already made significant advances, and introduction of the Scottish Child Payment of £10 per child per week by 2022, in my view, will prove a game changer and be of an enormous assistance to families, particularly women, that will benefit from distributing it within their household. Another game changer for hard-pressed families will be the extension of free early learning and childcare from 600 hours to 1,140 hours each year for every 3- and 4-year-olds and eligible 2-year-olds, which will start in August 2020. The action in the Fairer Scotland Action Plan covered an incredibly wide range of issues, everything from low income through housing, education, health, social security, justice, human rights to employability and discrimination, a truly comprehensive plan. The well-mentioned Professor Alston, the UN Special Rapporteur on extreme poverty and human rights, describes Scotland's plans as ambitious, a promising social security system, and puts Scotland on a very different trajectory from England when it comes to the social protection of its population. That is some plaudit from a well-respected individual of world note. Finally, Presiding Officer, with plans like this and the full powers of an independent country, Scotland will be able to eradicate something that's been a scourge for Scotland for decades, and that we will remove poverty and inequality. So therefore, I very much support this debate and the motions before us. Thank you.
Call Claudia Beamish to be followed by Bob Doris.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I too welcome the chance to discuss a vision for a fairer Scotland and recognise there have been a number of positive developments by the Scottish Government this term and by the Parliament when we have worked together to deliver. There is much, much further to go, as other members have said, despite successes. The Conservative government's approach to welfare policy has been cruel and castigatory, and the Scottish people have not always been sheltered from their many effects by the Scottish government, despite levers at their disposal, such as, for example, better action on addressing fuel poverty. In its wide-ranging report, I recognise that there are successes, as I said, but there are also challenges ahead. And I will only have time to touch on certain areas, but I share my Labour colleagues' commitment that a Labour government would take a really much more ambitious approach to redistribution of wealth and power for an equitable Scotland. It is absolutely right that our Scottish Labour amendment mentions tackling the climate emergency as part of a vision for a fairer Scotland. And I am disappointed that fair climate change action is omitted in both the original action plan in 2016 and this year's progress report. After all, the Climate Change Act of 2019 set Scotland on a path to net zero on a far steeper trajectory than this government has faced in its decade in power. And I do not think, despite the rhetoric, that the scale and the opportunity of that has been quite appreciated yet. It is exactly documents like this that should have a recognition of the climate change emergency and Scotland's response at its very core. This shift in our economy and society needs management, strategy and guidance from those in the affected industries and with the expertise alongside government. It needs a statutory Just Transition Commission with freedom to work independently of governments into the future and look to the long term. The climate crisis ties us all to a common fate, but it is the disadvantaged who will shoulder that burden both globally and here in Scotland. I will not stop pushing the Scottish Government until it starts thinking proactively about a Just Transition Commission and not just over the next 2 years. Let's shape our future together and see this necessity of change as an opportunity for the radical transformation of our society and economy for the better. A fairer, more democratic and equal Scotland underpinned by radical tax policies as well, and action by, hopefully, a UK Labour government next week. The Scottish Government's ambitions in the action plan are welcomed, but in almost every area they could go further. And I want to stress the possibility of multi-benefits that there are in taking a holistic action by government across portfolios, something that all parties find challenging, but which should be more effectively led by the Scottish Government. Taking on the poverty premium would mean a better quality of life for many, and it would help many out of fuel poverty. A home is a UN right, and certainly in Scotland, that should mean a warm home. But this more holistic approach needed. Local authorities are also suffering from a lack of capacity to fulfil their responsibilities, yet at the same time are being given more to do. This is a signifier of a much broader problem our councils face, deep cuts alongside less control over how they can spend that funding. Councils and their service users are crying out for more progressive alternatives, working alongside the third sector as well. And that translates also into transport poverty. The modal shift to public transport and active travel is also significant here, and the stark evidence of the links between socially deprived communities and poor air quality. I urge the Cabinet Secretary to work across portfolios to ensure more work is done to look at the Scottish Index of Multiple Deprivation data, to explore the link, as is recommended in the Clean Air for Scotland Strategy Independent Review. Action 14 includes an ambition to make fairer support for rural areas, which is of course important for many of my constituents in South Scotland. Again, I'm surprised to see rural poverty barely mentioned in the Progress Action Plan and would welcome some further comment in closing remarks today. I also highlight a further concern with the SIMD and in its organisation into data zones of 500 to 1,000 residents, potentially dispersing deprivation through a relatively large area. And can the Cabinet Secretary perhaps comment today on whether this methodology could obscure pockets of real deprivation amongst those who are living more geographically isolated? And would she consider the possibility of a review?
Aileen Campbell.
absolutely happy to always take on board other ideas from other political parties, happy to engage on Claudia on this. We do take rural poverty very seriously. We also have a number of poverty truth commissions where we engage, and that reflects the kind of the nature and the difference and variety of people and communities across the country. And in terms of working across portfolios, I certainly, along with Shirley Ann, we worked across portfolios to deliver the Scottish Child Payment. This portfolio also provides resources to Derek Mackay and his portfolio to enhance the ability for us to make better use of the childcare rollout to ensure that there's employability link up there as well. So we're absolutely, and if there are more things we can do, absolutely keen to look at it. But I hope that gives reassurance that we are committed to rural poverty, but we also are committed to working across the portfolio, because it's not one single portfolio that's going to be the solution to child poverty.
Claudia Beamish.
Right, I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that explanation. And finally, I support the aims to improve chances for women and girls in a fairer Scotland, and would welcome an update on efforts being made to encourage women to re-enter and to enter STEM-type careers, and, of course, to close the gap in all sectors. And I welcome the recognition of the flexible working, which can have a huge positive impact on women and unpaid carers in the workplace, the majority of whom are, of course, women, who need understanding employers, not just to meet their caring responsibilities, but also time for respite, which, frankly, could have better support from the Scottish Government. So to conclude, Presiding Officer, it seems the success of this action plan rests on a huge step change in ambition and more joined up government. More than 1 million people in Scotland live in poverty. Poverty and child poverty in Scotland are rising. Business as usual won't cut it for those people in hardship. And I ask the Scottish Government also to let the climate emergency give all governments the push they need to address this issue as well, and transform our economy and society, one that works for the many and the few as we move towards net zero. Thank you.
Bob Doris, followed by Shona Robson.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I want to focus on two areas in today's debate, and that is making Scotland fairer for children living in poverty and wider issues around benefit take-up. In doing so, I will offer praise for the powerful and effective actions of the Scottish Government. However, I will also point to where they could perhaps go further, and I think that's the right thing to do during this debate. But that is go further, of course, given if resources and powers in this place would permit. Now, I mean, no doubt the game changer that the Scottish Government's Scottish Child Payment will be. But what do I base that on? Well, I base it on the testimony of those living in poverty, not just living in poverty in my constituency of Maryhill and Springburn, but the direct experience the Scottish Government has sought to garner in relation to capture those experiences right across Scotland. Now, during Challenge Poverty Week in October this year, I attended an event hosted by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation and IPPR Scotland. It was looking specifically at the Scottish Child Payment. Those in attendance were groups working specifically with those living with families who were experiencing child poverty, and more importantly, those directly experiencing poverty at that time were also in the room. I was no doubt just how supportive they are. The Scottish Child Payment will see £10 a week per child additionally placed into the hands of low-income families. That's 410,000 children and 250,000 households. It will dramatically assist all families, but significantly it will lift 30,000 children out of poverty also. Now, I pay tribute to the families and the campaigners who had the Gimme 5 campaign looking for £5 per child per week. The Scottish Government listened, and it will deliver a tenner per child per week for those low-income households. So I say, well done the campaigners, well done those doughty terriers who are living in poverty, who are at the forefront of that campaign, but also well done to the Scottish Government for delivering on that ask and actually surpassing it. Now, I want to look at how we could go further, and of course we should set that in context. So I should put on the record the constraints in going further, given the fact that we will see a £3.7 billion cut to the welfare budgets in Scotland by 2021, and we'll see a £2 billion real terms cut to Scotland's budget around the same time. But what were those additional asks? So it was acknowledged, and the statistics show that those most likely to have children in poverty are those with families where they're under sixes in the household. So there was talk about how there could be a premium for that, a top-up again on that. Now, Presiding Officer, I know the money simply doesn't exist right now. That's a huge £180 million commitment that the Scottish Government has made. But it's an ask there, and it's not something that we should lose sight of going forward. And I also spoke to families who talked about that specific additional costs for teenagers in the household, particularly around summer holidays. Now, again, I pay tribute to the Scottish Government and actually to Glasgow City Council in relation to some of the work around holiday hunger. But that idea, perhaps, of even using those school clothing grant payments, because we have that data on record, to actioning some kind of payment just before the summer holidays to assist with that extra cost. Again, we know there's no magic money tree, but these are very real asks going forward for things we could roll out to help deliver. So I'm under no illusions about the challenges around that, but they made those asks, and I should put them on record here this afternoon. Of course I should. Yeah.
Sorry, Gil Patterson.
Thank Bob for taking that intervention. I'm just wondering, you started off, Bob, by telling the Chamber about the austerity cut and the volume of it. What could you do with that money if that wasn't being cut for the UK government?
Bob Doris.
Well, actually, let me answer that another way, Gil Patterson. Thank you for the question, because one of the ways we could fund these things, I mean, this £180 million commitment to tackling child poverty in Scotland is a unilateral decision by the Scottish Government. This is not happening anywhere else in the UK. Do you know if the rest of the UK decide to follow suit on that? That would probably be a £2 billion plus commitment to tackling child poverty elsewhere in the UK. Now, because the money supply that Scotland to get its own money back is dependent on spending elsewhere in the UK, if others in the UK, the next UK government was to actually make the same commitment, we would see a Barnett consequential come to Scotland of approximately £180 million. Just think what we could do with that. But I think the underlying point you're making, Mr Patterson, is why are we depending on spending decisions in London to dictate how much money this place and our country has of our own cash back to us to deliver for child poverty in Scotland? And I absolutely agree with the point that you make. I said also wanted to talk about benefits uptake, Presiding Officer, and Action 19 in the Fairer Scotland Action Plan talks about helping people claim the benefits they're entitled to, and 48 says help older people claim financial support that they're entitled to. And let me give you two statistics around that. Around 40% of pensioners, that's 130,000 in Scotland, don't claim the pension credit that they're entitled to. And only 31% of working families without children claim the tax credits they're entitled to. Now, however, the Scottish Government is restricted in their abilities to address this and to drive up uptake. And do you know that's because of the fiscal framework, Presiding Officer? Because the Scottish Government had a targeted campaign to drive up pension credit uptake, to drive up working tax credit uptake. That money could be clawed back by the UK Exchequer. That's actually disgusting. It's appalling that that should be the situation. But let me finish off by one final action in the Fairer Scotland Action Plan, and that says, make social security fairer where we can. Well, let me say, Cabinet Secretary and Presiding Officer, that with universal credit reserved to Westminster, with the rape clause, with the benefits freeze, with the withdrawal of pension credit to mixed-age couples, with PIP and DLA, although soon coming to Scotland, with the clawback of cash if we try to help out with that situation, the only way to fulfil Action 17 is to have every single social security power in this place return to Scotland. In fact, we'll only fully deliver Action Point 17 for Fairer Scotland Action Plan if we have Scottish independence.
Fiona Robertson, followed by Bill Kidd.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. As we've heard, in 2018-19, the Scottish Government has invested over £1.4 billion to support low-income households, including, for example, free school meals, the People Equity Fund, delivering affordable homes and supporting people with council tax alongside new social security measures, including the commitment to introduce the Scottish Child Payment, a new benefit designed to tackle child poverty head-on. This investment should be welcomed by all sides in the Chamber, but we must also recognise, as has been said, that we are spending over £100 million simply to mitigate the Tory government's assault on the welfare state. And that's why we need all aspects of welfare to be devolved to this Parliament. The motion notes that the 2018 annual report on welfare reforms estimated that UK government social security spending will reduce by up to £3.7 billion in Scotland by 2020-2021. And we need to think of how many people this will push into poverty, destitution or extreme hardship. And of course, there could be worse to come. For those of you as sad as me last night watching the STV election debate, you would have seen Jackson Carlaw's arrogant dismissal of questions about the Resolution Foundation's analysis of the Tory manifesto, which shows that child poverty is set to continue to rise under the Tory social security plans, reaching a 60-year high of 34%, a figure that Jackson Carlaw either didn't appear aware of or perhaps he just didn't care. Either way, it was not a good look. We only need to look at the Tory bedroom tax to see the harrowing effects of some of the most vulnerable in society. A report commissioned by the Department of Work and Pensions found that 78% of people affected by the bedroom tax regularly run out of money by the end of the week or the month. It also revealed that only a third of people affected who applied for emergency support to pay the rent received any help, and that 1 in 4 of those affected cut back on spending on things like heating and electric bills, and 44% had to reduce spending on food. And that's simply unacceptable in a modern, wealthy society. In Dundee alone, between April and September this year, an astonishing 4,735 discretionary housing payments were made to those on low incomes. As we know, the Scottish Government's DHP scheme is an extra payment to help with housing costs, including cuts to the local housing allowance and covering in full the impact of the bedroom tax. The total award value spent in Dundee City in this period was almost £2.5 million, with an average award value of £520. And I know this has been a lifeline for many of my constituents. The Government's Best Start grant and Best Start food schemes are also helping those in need. Studies have shown that the Best Start grant package is putting more money in the pockets of low-income families than the DWP system it replaced. These grants are making a huge difference to my constituents, with almost 2,500 payments being made in Dundee. The vast majority, 76% of the 3,265 applications processed from Dundee City were approved by Social Security Scotland. Across Scotland, £17.8 million of Best Start grants and Best Start food payments have been made to support people between December 2018 and September 2019. These payments are making a big difference to families across Scotland who are being pushed to the brink by continued Tory welfare cuts. This government has strived to mitigate the worst effects of the Tories' austerity agenda. Best Start grant and Best Start food payments sit in stark contrast to the two-child cap, benefits freeze and the disastrous universal credit rollout recklessly imposed by the Tories in government. This government, by contrast, has sent a strong message about the kind of country we can be. We can create a social security system which works to protect people rather than treating those on low incomes with the hostility and suspicion that they have been subjected to under the Tories. The Scottish Welfare Fund is an example of how we're working hard to achieve a fairer society built on compassion and kindness. New figures show that the Scottish Welfare Fund made 1,385 payments to people in Dundee in the last financial year. A total of 440 community care grants and 945 crisis grants were awarded between April and June of 2019 to people with essential needs such as food, heating costs and household items. But looking to the future, Deputy Presiding Officer, I recently had the privilege of being asked to chair the new Justice and Fairness Commission, involving people like the esteemed former Chief Medical Officer, Harry Burns, who knows a huge amount about the work needed to tackle health inequalities. And this commission is working to show how, with full powers, Scotland can tackle poverty and create that fairer society and more socially just Scotland. We intend to outline our vision of a fairer Scotland, a vision that can only truly be achieved through Scotland becoming an independent country with well-being and compassion at its heart. And Deputy Presiding Officer, what a different and inspiring perspective that will be for the people of Scotland.
The last of the open debate contributions is from Bill Kidd.
Officer, Thank you, President Officer. I would like to begin by recognising the tremendous work in this area that Aileen Campbell, Cabinet Secretary for Communities and Local Government, and my very old friend, has done in leading the way in building. I do apologise, actually, because as everyone knows, I'm too young to have any old friends. Has done in leading the way in building a more equitable Scotland. I applaud the vision and ambition for a Scotland where child poverty is no more and where people from all backgrounds experience real equality of opportunity. There has been a strong commitment from Ms Campbell and her colleagues, and this commitment has had results. We have already seen a significantly reduced number of children living in poverty. Looking forward to the upcoming new Scottish Child Payment, as has been mentioned, is anticipated to lift around 30,000 more children out of poverty, and families with children under the age of 6 will be able to claim this new benefit by Christmas 2020. The Child Poverty Action Group, independent of the Scottish Government, has described this payment as a game changer in tackling inequality. This and many other measures effected by the Scottish Government makes me excited about Scotland's future. These changes let us see the outline of a Scotland with the ambition to end child poverty and consequently break the cycle of poverty will be achieved. Whilst discussion of this vision is uplifting, the reality is that many people still face poverty on a daily basis. And since universal credit was introduced, we have seen food bank use increase. My own constituency of Glasgow Anniesland now has, very sadly, 5 operating food banks, very much operating, very busy. And this follows the introduction of universal credit. The Scottish Government has already spent £100 million in trying to mitigate the impact of the UK Government's welfare policies. And, Presiding Officer, there is a well-known analogy in economics of the rising tide of wealth. This analogy depicts a harbour where, as the tide of wealth comes in, all boats rise. What this picture means to illustrate is that the wealthier a country gets, or the wealthier individual people become, the better it is for the economy as a whole, and therefore it benefits society as a whole. This is a myth, and it has been proven to be both untrue and harmful. Yet so many people still believe it. We still see this myth in the rhetoric of people, parties and ideologies. It argues that it is not only fine for the rich to get richer, but it is better for us all. I would argue that the growth of the UK's economy, accompanied by the growth in food banks, evidences how untrue this myth is. It also affirms what Joseph Stiglitz, former chief economist of the World Bank, said in his book The Price of Inequality, exposes the economic truths of why trickle-down economics does not work in practice. Instead, when the rich get richer, the economy and the rest of the population suffer as a result. Yesterday, on the 3rd of December, the Equality Trust released a study looking at the distribution of wealth in the UK. I believe these findings highlight how untrue the myth of the rising tide is. The study found that the UK's 6 richest people control as much wealth as the poorest 13 million people. To provide some context, recent data shows that over 14 million people in the UK are living in recognised poverty. That is why tax is important. What tax really is about is not only funding public services, but fundamentally is about redistributing wealth. Wealth is not the only thing to be inherited. Poverty is inherited too. That is why tackling child poverty is so important. I think that if we look at the issues at hand about people having enough to feed their children and heat their homes, there must be common ground amongst all of us in a desire to fight child poverty. People, regardless of where or to whom they are born, have inherent value. As soon as we understand this, we start to prioritise public spending differently. This understanding of people's worth jars against the reality faced by so many families and so many children today. If we look at the findings of the aforementioned Professor Olsen, UN Rapporteur, face on, if we are honest about the reality of poverty experienced by millions of people, we will be far better placed to effect real and substantial change with relevant policies. I welcome the initiatives of the Fairer Scotland Action Plan, which seek to create this change, and I commend those working on its deployment for their ongoing and dedicated work. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Kidd. We move now to closing speeches, and I call on Alison Johnson to be followed by Sarah Boyack. Alison Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I think it's been a very interesting debate this afternoon, and obviously the Fairer Scotland report covers a huge range of policy areas. We've heard from several colleagues, I've heard from several colleagues about Professor Alston's comments, which are well documented and often cited in this chamber, and not surprisingly. I'd like to begin closing this afternoon on behalf of the Scottish Greens by referring to the work of Professor Morag Traynor, who sits on the Poverty and Inequality Commission, and a couple of years attended a summit that I hosted in the Parliament on women and austerity. And as part of our presentation, she highlighted the fact that poor families are paying 10 times more for a washing machine, something that we all use on a weekly basis. Poor families are paying 10 times more for a washing machine than you or I might, simply because they cannot get hold of, at a moment of extreme crisis, the £250, or when we were looking at this in 2017, there was a washing machine available for £160 from one retailer, but they couldn't get hold of that. You know, that might as well have been thousands of pounds. The case that we looked at that night, there was somebody who was going to end up paying £2,399 for a washing machine. And these are people who, because of an inability to access that small amount to us in the first place, that inability to access mainstream credit, that inability to set up a direct debit. There's even a Dundee story where someone's paying £3,000 for a washing machine. Go online, I'm not going to name the retailers, but with APRs of 70% and so on, you can see why this is an issue. The reason I'm highlighting that is because it fundamentally underlines the importance of income to poverty. We speak in this chamber of fuel poverty, we speak of food poverty, we speak of period poverty, but it all comes down to the fact that at the end of the day, you don't have enough cash in your pocket to pay for the things that you need when you need them. So it also underlines why food banks are not the solution. Going to a food bank for emergency food aid, I mean, something I never thought we would see in this affluent country, cannot become normalised because it will not help people when they need other things like a washing machine. That's why I'm focusing on that to kick off. And I think this has been an interesting debate this afternoon. You know, it's right that we highlight, that the government highlights the negative impact of the Tories' desire for the hardest of Brexits. It will impact negatively on people in Scotland. It will impact on our ability to provide high-quality jobs. It will impact on our ability to collaborate with regards, in regards to research across the EU. It potentially can push 130,000 Scots into poverty. But I think my starting point today is the importance of income maximisation schemes to tackling poverty. We know that where schemes exist, successful schemes like Healthier, Wealthier Children, they have ensured that thousands of pounds have found their ways into the families on low incomes who most need access to this cash. There's been discussion too from Alison Harris notably and Alex Cole-Hamilton on the importance of childcare to addressing poverty and to addressing the gender pay gap. But the flexibility that we need to see is not yet in place. I represent Lothian, but I've had correspondence from people across Scotland on the fact that they can't yet access the childcare hours they need to make work possible for them. There's been some discussion too on the introduction of the real living wage. We really need to see that become the norm, and any steps that the Scottish Government can take must be taken. You know, when we have criteria around contracts being awarded and so on, it's absolutely key that that is at the heart of it. NHS Health Scotland, they produced a report entitled Comparing the Impact of Incentives to Improve Health and Reduce Health Inequalities, and they came to the conclusion that the most effective income-based policies for reducing health inequalities are likely to be those that disproportionately increase the incomes of those with the lowest income. Now, the child payment it's hugely welcomed, of course it is, but I will ask the government again to do everything they can to ensure that it reaches all those families, because there are still issues around take-up where provision isn't universal. I mean, I think even where we know that families are entitled to free school meals, provision increases when it's set in a universal context. There are some children who there are situations that I'm aware of where the privacy around being given that free school meal isn't there. We have to make sure that no one in a class is aware that their friend is receiving a free school meal as an entitlement. Now, Larry Flanagan of the EIS was quite clear on the radio this morning of the impact of austerity in our classrooms. You know, he spoke about, we've all heard cases where you know, teachers have toasters in their room, they are providing breakfast, they are assisting with toothbrushing, things that weren't expected of them previously, and things that, quite frankly, shouldn't be required of them. I mean, Jeremy Balfour suggested that people shouldn't make promises they can't keep, but I would just remind Mr Balfour that the Tories told us that no one would be worse off under universal credit, and unfortunately that is sadly not the case. I mean, not only has universal credit proven itself to be entirely dysfunctional in terms of delivery, I mean, a torturous 5-week wait, an abomination of a rape clause, you know, referred to as double support by Esther McVeigh. There is a lot of harm, there's so much harm being done by UK welfare reform, but this Parliament has to do everything it can to address the inequality that faces so many people in Scotland. I mean, I joined Scotland Forward, the campaign for a devolved Parliament, before I joined the Scottish Green Party, and I find it hugely frustrating that we have to mitigate policies made at Westminster. You know, Philip Alston, the UN rapporteur, commented on that too. He found that entirely inappropriate, to put it mildly. I realise I'm running out of time, presiding officer. The Scottish Greens this evening will be pleased to support the Labour amendment. We will not support the Conservative amendment because of what it takes out, and we will support the government motion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I call on Sarah Boyack to wind up for the Labour Party.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This debate has been a great chance for us all to look at what's been achieved, but also what more needs to be done to deliver fairer Scotland. And as Pauline McNeill said in her opening speech, and it's been repeated by colleagues across the parties, let us not forget the reality of inequality and poverty in our own communities. 14,000 more children became homeless in the last year alone, so there is so much more that needs to be done. And we also need to look at the detail in the report that was published yesterday. As several people have said, let's look at the checklist of what's been done. There's not enough yet. So what has the Scottish Government learned from its own gender pay ratios? How does the Scottish Government propose to ensure both flexibility and stability for workers? Why is the Returners project, which was due to launch in 2016 to bring experienced women back into the workforce after a career break, being delayed? And given that the government has stated it's already met its target to reduce youth unemployment by 40% by 2021, what's going to happen next? How do the government ensure that this reduction is not just maintained, but continues to reduce? And without a UK Labour government, we're not going to see the big increases in the Scottish budget we urgently need, that £10 billion a year that would come to us. And finally, in terms of detailed questions, look at the commitment on the Young Scot Transport card. It's now smart, but it doesn't give you free transport across our young people up to the age of 25. So the targets need to be tough and they need to be pursued properly. Last week we debated violence against women, and I highlighted, as did others, the fact that violence against women is both a cause and a consequence of gender inequality. So it's really good, while we're still in the 16 days of action against violence against women, to hear speakers from different parties talking about the centrality of eradicating inequality for women by tackling the quality of part-time and flexible jobs available and making them available and attractive to everyone. So I'd ask colleagues to look at the work of Timewise to produce an updated flexible jobs index for Scotland in 2020. This will give us a new benchmark of the ratio of quality jobs open to flexible or part-time working, and will let us look at whether employers are applying flexible working to the hire process. The opposite of the gig economy and insecure work, something tangible that will improve women's lives. And as the Cabinet Secretary and others in the Chamber have mentioned, far too many children in Scotland are living in poverty. Strikingly, the numbers living in families where one parent is in work are rising. That cannot be right. And the steps such as committing to the rights contained in the Convention on the Rights of the Child are positive, and as outlined by the UN Special Rapporteur, are important in making a real difference for those in poverty. But what's key is that ensuring those measures aren't just good rhetoric, but they're upheld and implemented and acceptable. And we cannot accept the Tory amendment tonight because it deletes reference to the UN Special Rapporteur's report. How can we ignore the austerity and the 3.7 billion welfare cuts that are hitting our families across Scotland? Social security cuts, such as the despicable two-child cap, are leaving families and children struggling. Now, we welcome the introduction of the Scottish Child Payment, but worry about the 58,000 6-year-olds who will lose out on the Scottish Child Payment when they turn 7, and the payment for all children is not yet being introduced. And inequality from birth is becoming more and more difficult to overcome. For example, the attainment gap in education between the wealthiest and poorest children is stagnant in Scotland. And there's currently the equivalent of a 3 years education between the two groups. And as many have commented, we need a future workforce skilled in STEM to help us in tackling the climate emergency. But the figures released today show that there is a 98-point gap in science between the richest and the poorest students. And then there's yesterday's PISA results, which are deeply disappointing. Our amendment calls for a joined-up approach to tackling the climate emergency. It was acknowledged by the Cabinet Secretary. It needs to run right across everything. And Scottish Labour believes that we need a joined-up approach so that by 2030, we've not just achieved our climate target, but we've also dealt with the growing inequalities and insecurities people face across Scotland through lack of jobs and lack of investment. We need low-carbon community infrastructure now to deliver the community benefits, deliver on fuel poverty and deliver warm homes for everyone. So the transition to a net zero by 2045 has got to be guided by a Just Transition Commission that's statutory, independent of government and long-term, so that the right voices are heard and no one is left behind. Today's debate has been really good about enabling people to dig into the detail but also look at the bigger principles. The aims of the Fairer Scotland report are commendable, but its impact is critical. And as Pauline McNeill said, we've got to make sure that while there's been some progress, we're not seeing an increase in poverty. We've got to make sure that this cuts right across government. We wouldn't be doing our jobs as parliamentarians if we didn't hold the Scottish Government to account. And while there has been progress, poverty in Scotland has grown. Scottish Labour would take a very different, much more ambitious approach, both from the Scottish Government and at the UK level, to initiate not just a shift in wealth, but a shift in power, to bring about the long-term change for the many, not the few. At decision time, we'll be supporting the Green Amendment alongside ours. Both of those amendments add to the Scottish Government's amendment. So we are critical, but we're also prepared to be constructive and work together. But as many members have commented, UK Tory welfare policies are pushing people into poverty, so we will absolutely not be supporting their amendment tonight. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. And I call on Alexander Stewart to wind up for the Conservative Party.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. On behalf of the Scottish Conservatives, I am pleased to be able to close this important debate today. As many already know, prior to me becoming a member of the Scottish Parliament, I spent almost 2 decades working closely alongside those with disabilities and learning difficulties in that sector. This work really opened my eyes, Deputy Presiding Officer, to the constant struggle that many of them endure on a day-to-day basis with their lives. Indeed, this past involvement and experience was recognised when I was asked to open the Perth and Kinross Making Where We Live Better conference. Having a home, having a job and having hobbies gives the opportunity to ensure that you have a lifestyle, and individuals with these require that. As a result of my work, I fully understand the importance of discussing and raising awareness of the many discriminatory issues which still face people living with a disability. And despite the action plan being in progress for around 3 years, we already have seen it launched back in 2016, the Fairer Scotland Action Plan, and it had 5 key ambitions for 2030. And it seems 2 years on, however, there is still much work to be done. We have to acknowledge that, yes, there has been some progress, but we still have in existence poverty, the employment gap, and also the pay gap. With 26% of disabled people in Scotland are likely to have no qualifications compared to 10% of non-disabled people, and that has to change. we need to increase opportunities for disabled people to enter the workplace and to be supported to ensure that they can achieve their goals. They have goals and they have ambitions, and that is quite right, Presiding Officer. But only about 50% of disabled people of working age are working, compared to around 80% of non-disabled people at the same stage. So employment rates greatly vary according to the types of impairment persons may have. I'm happy to take an intervention.
Annabel Ewing.
I'm grateful to the member for taking an intervention. A member was focusing on the position of disabled people, and quite rightly so. But in light of the fact the UN Committee on the Rights of Disabled People concluded in 2016 that austerity policies and the pursuit of welfare reforms amounted to a systematic breach of disabled people's human rights, is the member not embarrassed by his Tory party record?
Alexander Stewart.
Annabel Ewing makes an important point. And I acknowledge that there are some difficulties, but I believe firmly that the UK government is tackling and attempting to move forward and ensure that individuals get that opportunity and respect that they deserve. People with a mental health condition also have considerable difficulty in ensuring that they receive employment, and that is sitting about 21%, and the employment rate for people with learning disabilities is hovering around 26%. The fact exists that 20% of Scotland's population, 1.03 million, were indicated at living in relative poverty, according to their housing costs between 2000 and... I want to make some more progress. Presiding Officer, there are more economically inactive people in Scotland. The rate for those between the age of 16 and 64 is sitting at about 22%. That is far too high. In addition, we've also heard today from the Scottish Government the figures talking about a quarter of Scottish children living in relative poverty. Now, we have already heard today that the UK Government and the Scottish Government have put actions in place to ensure and support these individuals. And I pay tribute to the work that's been done to date, but there is still a lot to be done, especially when it comes to ensuring that there is employment. That is properly ensured. If we can get people into employment, that will ensure that we take them out of the poverty situation that they may find themselves in. Now, the Cabinet Secretary spoke earlier in the debate today about the progress that has been made with reference to the Scottish Government, and she and others have also examined and criticised the Westminster Government for what they have done and what they have achieved to date. And as I've said already, the Westminster Government has done more to ensure that more people are in work. And that is the best way to ensure that we ensure living standards grow. Benefits are there as a net. No, I want to make some progress. Benefits are there as a safety net. And the safety net is there, and the safety net does work for many individuals. We have a strong economy, and that's what's required, to have a strong economy to ensure that people get the opportunity to work. You've talked about respect. You've talked about respect already. No, I wish to make progress. You've talked about respect already here today, and I believe that that word is used and should be used to ensure that action groups are there in place to ensure that we do look after families. Jeremy Balfour talked about the failings that have happened when it comes to the education system under over a decade of the SNP. And education policy is failing a generation of lost opportunities. But as I say, if they get the right education and the right involvement, then they will get into employment. Pauline McNeill talked about the homeless statistics that we have seen, and that they need to go further to ensure that poverty is tackled in that way. Young people who are suffering illness or mental health need to be treated better, and we've already seen some of the statistics that cover on that. Alison Johnson talked about the assessment process and the need to progress that approach, talking about the local government supporting welfare funds, and that is there. Alex Cole-Hamilton talked about the targets that have not yet been met. 19 out of the 50 are in progress, but there's still a lot of work to do. The Scottish Government needs to find and meet the targets to ensure that they're not letting down people. Alison Harris talked about the need to ensure that education is the proper way and the best start in life and the right way to choose, because giving a child the chance to succeed is the opportunity that they require. Presiding Officer, we here in the Scottish Conservatives are fully committed to making Scotland a fairer place for everyone in society, regardless of their gender, disability, race, sexuality, age or religion. We obviously agree with the opportunities that must be available to ensure in order that we are able to fulfil and people have the able to fulfil their potential and become active members of the society. The Scottish Conservatives and the UK Conservative Government has worked tirelessly to ensure that the United Kingdom is a fairer place for people to live and work, and I support the amendment in Jeremy Balfour's name. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I call on the Cabinet Secretary, Shirley Somerville, to conclude our debate.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We have heard today about the action that the Scottish Government is taking to tackle poverty and to make Scotland a fairer, more equal society. We've also heard about the scope of the challenge facing us. Brexit is still looming on the horizon, and we have lived with a decade of UK Government cuts to welfare. This is against a backdrop of social security spending in Scotland being cut by an estimated £3.7 billion by 2021. Last year, we invested £1.4 billion to support low-income households. This includes over £100 million to mitigate the UK Government welfare cuts. Since the Scottish Welfare Fund was established in 2013, nearly £210 million have been paid out to almost 350,000 households. These are households in crisis, accessing emergency funding to help with the costs of the essentials. In addition, the Scottish Government has been mitigating the bedroom tax in full using discretionary housing payments since 2014-15. We remain committed to doing so until it can be abolished at source through universal credit, which we are reliant on the Department of Work and Pensions to deliver. For the current financial year, we are allocating £53 million for the bedroom tax mitigation, supporting around 70,000 households. That we even have to invest this money each year was described by the UN Special Rapporteur for Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, Professor Philip Alston, as outrageous and unsustainable. I am not surprised, Presiding Officer, that Professor Alston is regularly quoted in such debates, given the strength of the evidence he saw and the strength of the comments that he made based on that evidence. He also made it clear in his report published in May this year that the UK Government's austerity cuts and welfare reforms, such as universal credit in its current form, the two-child limit and abhorrent rate clause, the benefit cap, the benefit freeze and sanctions regime, were pushing more and more people into serious hardship, food bank use and rent arrears. I'm sorry, Alexander Stewart, it is not working for people the length and breadth of this country. Although many of the social security and employment levers remain reserved to the UK Government, the Scottish Government will use all the powers it currently has to work towards achieving a fairer and more equal society, with opportunities for everyone to fulfil their potential. In Scotland, we have taken a completely different approach to our devolved services, treating people with dignity, fairness and respect. We rightly recognise our expenditure as an investment in the people of Scotland. To see this principle in practice, we need only look at the establishment of Social Security Scotland. We believe social security should be there to support people to get what they are entitled to and support them to get that financial support when they are entitled to it. I have talked before about hearing from people directly who have the fear of the DWP brown envelope coming through the doors. The Tories should be ashamed of that. They should be ashamed at the barriers they put in the way of people, the rhetoric that they have pushed, the poverty and hardship they have created and the damage that is having across our society. And whilst I've heard about employment helping people out of poverty, and again I've heard it again today, I totally agree with that principle. But what we don't hear is the end of what is going on with people who are in employment. Low-paid jobs, jobs that they're having difficulty in accessing the hours that they require, jobs that don't pay sufficiently. We don't hear from the Tories about fair employment. It needs to be decent hours with fair pay. That's why the Tories should also be ashamed of the research from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, which highlights that across the UK, in-work poverty has been rising faster than employment, driven almost entirely by increasing poverty amongst working-aged parents. This year, we will make payments of around £350 million through our 7 new benefits, and with more on the way. And you've already heard from Aileen Campbell at the beginning of the debate about the benefits of the Best Start grant and Carer Supplement. and of course the game-changing Scottish Child Payment, which we are working hard to deliver by the end of the next year. Many of the contributions today have focused on the impact that that is having on their communities, and quite rightly so. Social security is not the only way to tackle poverty, but it is one way to get money directly into the pockets of people who need it.
Certainly.
Claudia Beamish.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for taking intervention, and I'm very much hoping that she will, in the short time left, comment on the failure of the Scottish Government to recognise the climate emergency in the action plan or in an update to it. Thank you.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I was just about to go on, presiding officer, to the consensual and constructive tone taken by Scottish Labour today in the debate, and why we're willing to support the Scottish Labour amendment on that issue. So I recognise the absolute importance of the climate emergency. So does the Scottish Government. It has been clear from the discussions we've had in this chamber, not necessarily in this debate because of how much we've squeezed in, but certainly from Rosanna Cunningham and others. But can I touch on some of the points raised by Pauline McNeill, who talked about the uptake of benefits? And I absolutely appreciate her personal determination to make sure we can do everything to automate those benefit payments wherever possible. She mentioned the concept of a standalone benefit rather than a top-up benefit for the Scottish Child Payment. I would say it simply can't be done in the time that we have available. If we do it that way, we would not be able to deliver it in the time that we're looking to by Christmas next year. But I'm certainly as keen, I think, as she is on the concept of automation and seeing what we can do. And that's why we're looking at example what we can be done to link the Scottish Child Payment and the Best Start grant payments to see if we've got that information of people, how can we link that forward. That's one example, and I know there are many others that she has mentioned in the past as well. Sarah Boyack also spoke about how many of the welfare cuts directly impact on women at their strongest. She talked very passionately about the inequality of women, and I would absolutely concur with the remarks that she made around the importance of recognising that. She also mentioned when the Scottish Child Payment about those who will turn 6. We are delivering early for under 60s, and we'll deliver that payment by Christmas of next year. We simply cannot continue to pay benefits when when children go over 6, because we simply don't have the data from the DWP. If we have asked for it, we are asking for that timetable to be brought forward by the DWP, but it's simply not within our gift to be able to pay a benefit to those who we do not have the data on to ensure that eligibility is checked. It is something which I can assure Sarah Boyack and others that we are looking at very seriously, but it is down to the data that we have available on that. Alex Cole-Hamilton and others spoke about the importance of early years and childcare. The Scottish Government is absolutely determined to ensure that those who are eligible, that are 2-year-old, can take up and do take up that place. There's additional work going in to ensure that that can happen, but we are seeing an increase in the number of 2-year-olds that are registered for funded places. As I say, more activity is ongoing on that, and authorities are absolutely determined to work as hard as they can with their partners to prepare for August 2020 in every way that they possibly can. We do obviously also recognise the absolutely integral role that private providers will play in that as well. Alison Johnson spoke about the impact and the importance of income maximisation. That's exactly why the Scottish Government is funding through Citizens Advice Bureaus, the Money Talks teams, and also the new Carnegie UK Loan Fund to look at supporting affordable lending. She is absolutely right to point out that we do need to look at that ability for someone to be able to access funding at a time of crisis. And I would absolutely agree with her on the importance of the take-up of the Scottish Child Payment. There is no point any of us putting all this work into delivering a benefit if those who are entitled to it don't know about it and aren't encouraged and supported to apply to that. So I would absolutely agree with her point on that. In conclusion, presiding officer, many in the chamber may have seen the Channel 4 Dispatches programme on Monday night talking about particularly children affected by poverty. I would suggest, particularly given some of the contributions from the Conservative Party today, that they didn't see it and they perhaps should catch up with it. It was quite simply heartbreaking to watch young people talk about the impact of poverty on their daily lives, on their education, on their health, on their mental well-being. So we are absolutely clear-eyed about the scale of the challenge that we face. Tackling poverty and improving the lives of anyone in Scotland who needs help requires ambition and determination, and that's why this government has the plans and the actions to demonstrate that is put into practice. Professor Philip Alston said the spirit of the welfare state is alive and humming in Scotland, while it is on the wane in the rest of the UK. That is absolutely right, and it could wane even further if we face further more years of Tory austerity and welfare cuts. Professor Alston is absolutely right to talk about the fact that it's not just a disgrace, but a social calamity and an economic disaster all rolled into one, and poverty is leading to tragic consequences. Scotland has had enough of those consequences. Consequences we didn't vote for, we don't agree in, and yet they are imposed on us anyway. We have done so much with the limited powers that we have. We could do so much more if this Parliament had the full powers to create a fairer Scotland.
Thank you very much. That concludes our debate on achieving a fairer Scotland. The next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 20119 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau setting out a business programme. Can I ask Graham Day to move this motion?
Move, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. And no one wishes to speak against the motion. The question, therefore, is that motion 20119 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. The next item is consideration of Business Motion 20120, also in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau on the Stage 1 timetable of a bill. Could I ask Graham Day to move this motion?
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. And again, no one is asked to speak on the motion. The question, therefore, is that motion 20120 be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Thank you. The next item is consideration of 4 Parliamentary Bureau motions. Could I call on Graham Day to move 20121, 20122 on designation of a lead committee, and 20123 and 20124 on approval of an SSI?
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. Now, I am minded to accept a motion without notice to bring forward decision time until now. Could I call on the Minister for Parliamentary Business to move such a motion?
Moved, Presiding Officer.
Thank you. Unless anyone objects. No one objects. The question, therefore, is that decision time be brought forward to now. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. Thank you very much. So we move to decision time. The first question is that Amendment 20110.1 in the name of Jeremy Balfour, which seeks to amend motion 20110 in the name of Aileen Campbell on achieving a fairer Scotland, be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote. Members may cast their votes now. Amendment number 20110.1 in the name of Jeremy Balfour is yes 18, no 74. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. The next question is that Amendment 20110.3 in the name of Pauline McNeill, which seeks to amend the motion in the name of Aileen Campbell, be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We're not agreed. We'll move to a vote. Members may cast their votes now. Result of the vote on amendment number 20110.3 in the name of Pauline McNeill is yes 70, no 21. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed. The next question is that Amendment 20110.2 in the name of Alison Johnson, which seeks to amend the motion in the name of Aileen Campbell, be agreed. Are we agreed? No. We're not agreed again. We'll move to a vote. Members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 20110.2 in the name of Alison Johnson is yes 23, no 69. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. And the next question is that motion 20110 in the name of Aileen Campbell, as amended, on achieving a fairer Scotland be agreed. Are we agreed? Yes. We are not agreed. We'll move to a vote. Members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion 20110 in the name of Aileen Campbell as amended is yes 70, no 22. There were no abstentions. The motion as amended is therefore agreed. I propose to ask a single question on 4 Parliamentary Bureau motions. Does anyone object? That's good. The question is that motions 20121 to 20124 in the name of Graham Day on behalf of the Bureau be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed, and that concludes decision time. We're going to move shortly to members' business in the name of Gail Ross on unfair delivery charges. But we'll just take a few moments for members to change seats and the Minister to change seats. Just a short pause.